Hello and welcome to the first tutorial on using 3D sculpting to learn anatomy. And this is what we're going to make, the posterior triangle of the neck. This is the right side, but you can make whichever side you wish. There's a couple of things to go over that we just need to identify before we get started. Any anatomical area like this, the best way to divide it up is to consider that it's a kind of box. So the box will have a roof, a floor, four sides. These are what we call the relations. So in this case, for instance, we've got this box which is transparent, and we can see the six sides around it. And so they make up the relations or the surroundings or the boundaries as well. And then we consider the contents, which is the bits that are inside the box. And they can be broken down systematically into, for instance, arteries, veins, nerves, lymphatics, bones, muscles, ligaments, etc. And once you consider that, it's actually then quite easy to put it all together. Okay, so now we can get into making our posterior triangle. But to try and make things a little bit easier, I've done these simple digital sketches. So this shows us the boundaries or the margins of the posterior triangle. So on the right we have the sternomastoid with the two heads, on the left trapezius, and the base of the triangle made up with the clavicle. So we'll start off with the clavicle, and simplest thing to use is this thing, the tube, which is basically a vector object. And then of course you can mold the tube. When you look at the menu at the top, you can see how you can alter the two ends differently. So you can have a wide end at one end and a narrow end at the other. And similarly, you can have two holes that are different sizes. The other thing is these little points, prior to you validating a primitive like this, you can actually use it to manipulate it quite well. And so that's actually a good way to do quite a lot of the molding or sculpting before you validate it. Once you validate it, it becomes fixed in that position. Then you've got to have to deform it using push and pull and all the other sort of tools. Now the clavicle has got this sort of S-shaped bend towards the lateral end where it articulates with the acromion, which is the part of the scapula. And medially it's a bit more narrow. But in this case, we'll just leave it like that, and then we'll, so we're just starting to do the muscles here. So I'm just using a cone, which I've squashed prior to validating. And then of course you can stretch it all up and everything. And so this will make up the trapezius on the one side. Take your time with this, there's no hurry. Just pause the video because it's actually very important to get used to doing these bits, so that you're comfortable doing it. Now I'm using the push tool, or the move tool, as it were, to move bits of the trapezius once it's been validated. So as I said, once you validate a primitive, you can't bend it and flex it anymore. You've then got to deform it using your other tools. We can similarly use a cylinder to make the sternomastoid. Now the sternomastoid has two heads, but we'll just do the deep part of the sternomastoid to start with, which will go upwards and backwards from the medial sort of 1/3 or 1/4 of the clavicle, and the superficial head, which actually I'll show you in a minute, comes down and will extend medially and attach to the manubrium, or the upper margin of the manubrium, which is part of the sternum. In this case, it's important to get the angles right, because obviously the posterior triangle, which is basically the bit over your shoulder and just below that, going down onto your chest, is an oblique structure. And so we need to get that sort of angle correct. Once the primitive, so cylinders, boxes, these are the main things to use. So once the sternomastoid is in the right position, you can then just mold it again. And so I'm just using again the move tool, have it on quite low, and but quite wide, and then so that makes it much more sort of gentle in how it affects your object. Now, this is one of the important things, is to duplicate objects readily, and then you can deform the second one, and so that way you don't have to keep making things from scratch. In fact, I do it quite a lot in Nomad, where I actually put together bits and then save them as assets that you can then import in when you're doing things later on. So that saves you a lot of trouble. For instance, I've got some teeth that I put together like that, and shapes of the cochlea and the middle ear and stuff, and the ossicles and so on. Now, the other thing is I always like to sort of just colour them in as I go along. So in this case, the muscles, obviously, they're sort of red in the middle, but then you've got quite shiny tendons at either end and some sort of fascia and stuff in the middle. Now, using the masking tool with the lasso, you actually select a piece of an object and then extract it, which basically means it will duplicate that surface area of the bit that you've selected, and so gives you a duplicate object which you can then colour. And what I find useful with that is that instead of having the whole muscle as one single structure, where if you forget, you just press paint all when you're painting things, and it'll paint the whole thing red or whatever, and suddenly you've lost any of the sort of the, because we're going to try and do the tendons in sort of shiny white and the muscle in red. But if the tendon bits are actually different objects, like in this case, then it doesn't matter, because when you're painting the muscle bit, it won't affect the colour or painting of the tendons, because we've extracted them as separate objects. Now, once we've you need to texture it a little bit. Now, you can use some textures and things from the alphas, which give you certain patterns, but it's not possible to use any other textures here, unfortunately. So, which is fine, really. But then it means you may have to try and create some. So I try and do some, with different colours and things, and put some bits superficially, on them. So you need a little bit of, basically, you need that deep red for the muscle, which is made up of muscle fibres, myoglobin, hemoglobin, all that. But then you need a little bit of this shiny material to signify collagen and connective tissue, and the shiny sort of appearance you get of things like tendons and fascia and loose areolar tissue and that sort of thing. So now we've got our two bits of the sternomastoid, and we've got our trapezius, and so you can spend a bit of time fiddling around with this. Colouring a bit more. I think these tendons need to be a bit more shiny, a bit more white, just so that it looks a bit more like muscle rather than anything else. And I'll just put a little bit of the white over the muscle itself to signify sort of fascia and supportive tissues. Of course, muscles have blood vessels in them as well, so you can actually draw these in. Now we're just going to take another primitive in order to make a little structure near the apex. Just widen this trapezius up a little bit, because I think it's a little bit too narrow at the top. And of course the trapezius is a very large muscle. It covers most of the back and so on. So we're only demonstrating a small part of it, in the that posterior margin of the posterior triangle, but it actually extends quite widely over the back and to the other side. So we're now just putting a bit more of that shiny paint in. So it's basically the paint texture, all you have to do is reduce the roughness and increase the metalness, And that'll give you a much more sort of shiny result. Also the other thing is that it's impacted on by the lighting that you're using. Now I always use HDRIs, which are the high dynamic range images. There's several that come with Nomad, and I've downloaded a load of others. You can actually find a lot of HDRI images online for free. And the important thing is the HDRI image itself not only projects the light, but also in particularly shiny objects, you can actually see reflections of that image. So we just finish off a bit more of the coloring. And I'm trying to use one of the textures here, one of the alphas. There's a nice alpha which has got these sort of parallel lines, but I don't know how to get it to point in the direction that we're painting. So unfortunately they sometimes end up just going in a sort of skewed direction. Now this primitive, which is basically a sphere, we're going to just put that behind the insertion of sternomastoid, so the top end. And of course muscles are determined by, their origins and insertions are determined by which bit is being moved. So the origin will usually be the part that stays still, which will be the clavicle and manubrium. And the part that moves, in this case the mastoid tip and part of the skull, actually moves, so that's called the insertion. And of course the contraction of the sternomastoid on one side of the neck leads to turning the head in the opposite direction. So it works in such a way that it, shortening that distance, pulls that mastoid tip and ear downwards on that side, thus turning the head in the opposite direction. And similarly, the other sternomastoid on the other side of the neck will do the opposite. Now, in order to make it look a little bit like bone, you just need some kind of off-white. The inside of bones tend to have some honeycomb in it with a bit of bone marrow, and so those sort of textures would be much more sort of like dark dots on a background of off-white. But the surface of bones generally tend to be quite smooth and regular, so a little bit of just off-white, off-yellow will be fine. So I've put that on both the mastoid tip and the clavicle. Okay, so now, now we'll do the floor of the posterior triangle. So I've put in 3 of the important muscles. From superior downwards, we've got semispinalis capitis, splenius capitis, and then we've got scalenus medius. Now you might be wondering, why is scalenus medius there and not levator scapulae? Well, levator scapulae is actually more superficial, and so we'll put that in the next layer. The easiest way to create these muscles is to just duplicate our standard muscles we've already got. So the deep layer of sternomastoid will do just fine because it's quite rectangular, and we can simply lift that up, rotate it, and you can deform it using the gizmo to stretch it and widen it and so on, and thin it down a little bit if necessary. Put it in the right place, and that'll take care of our most superior part, which is semispinalis capitis. And then subsequently we'll duplicate that again and put in our splenius capitis, which is obviously quite another large muscle. Now the next one down would be levator scapulae, which is a superficial layer, and then further in would be scalenus medius. So what we'll do is we'll just label these and have a look at another one of my sketches to show the position of levator scapulae. So that's quite a big bulky muscle running in the middle, and so above it you can see splenius capitis showing, and below it you can see scalenus medius showing. So we'll make our Levator Scapulae now, which will be, which needs to be a much more sort of beefy, bigger muscle. And again, you can do it simply by duplicating one of the existing muscles, and then you can just sort of thicken it up a bit using the gizmo and stretch it up and widen it if necessary. So these are obviously paraspinal muscles, which is why they're quite big and quite bulky, and that's why they make up the floor basically, because it's between the posterior triangle and heading towards the spinal column. Now we'll take a smaller version of one of the muscles, so the sternomastoid, and use that to make our scalenus medius. It should actually be, so that'll be a little bit deeper to Levator Scapulae. And then interestingly, below scalenus medius, there is a gap, which is very important for the contents of the posterior triangle. Excuse me. So now we'll just straighten these bits out and have a little look at the sort of profile. So what we've done is put the four muscles together to make up the floor, so you can then move them all together as one component. So we'll just do a little bit more of the colouring and so on, just to try and make it look a little bit more natural. Yes, I think scalenus medius needs to be a bit smaller, so we'll just narrow that a little bit and shorten it a little bit. So once the floor is nice and even, looks a bit better, we'll stretch these up a little bit more, and then we can proceed with the rest of the floor and the content. So that's Levator Scapulae, which is I'm trying to enlarge it quite a bit so that it's quite prominent in the floor there. Now, after this, we'll check another diagram, and so on this painting I've put in scalenus anterior. You can see it peeping out just behind the margin of sternomastoid, and it's got the phrenic nerve on it, so we'll make up that bit next. And for that we'll just use another duplication of one of the smaller muscles and bring that over. So scalenus anterior inserts into the first rib, and it has a gap behind it and a gap in front of it. And these are particularly important because two great vessels pass through there and several other structures. The scalenus anterior will be passing downwards like that, with the phrenic nerve crossing its anterior surface. Now the phrenic nerve, which of course is probably one of the most important nerves in the body, C345, keeps the diaphragm alive. So it's the only innervation we have for the diaphragm, and because they come off the C3, 4 and 5 cervical nerve roots, transection of the spinal cord above that level is the catastrophic injury that Christopher Reeve had, which basically stops you from breathing. So you need to then be on a ventilator permanently. But any injury to the spinal cord below the level of C5 will mean you can continue to breathe. Your ventilator function will continue because the diaphragm is not paralyzed. So we've got scalenus anterior in there now, and we'll create the phrenic with another little tube. but it needs to be very narrow. It's quite a small structure. That's the other good thing, is you can hide many of the structures to give you better access to deeper layers that you can then sculpt better and put in sort of finer structures and things. So here we'll put in the little tube for the phrenic, and then we'll colour it. I think I've got it angled the wrong way on this one. So it should be running the other way actually. It should be running from lateral to medial. That way it can pass medial to the first rib and down into the chest. Alright, we'll put sternomastoid back. And so now we've got phrenic and the scalenus anterior. We can then start putting in some of the other major structures. That's reasonable position, I think. That looks pretty good. So we'll look at another of my paintings. So on this one, I've put in the subclavian vein, which runs in front of the scalenus anterior, and the external jugular vein, together with the dorsal scapular nerve, which comes out from the scalenus medius and passes underneath and into Levator Scapulae. So we'll put all those structures in, and the best way to make these vessels is using tubes of variable diameters. So we can use one and increase its size. And of course, as I said, you know, those little blobs, you can actually move them around to allow you to mold the shape much better prior to validating the primitive. And of course, once you validated it, it becomes much more difficult to then bend a tube. You end up, if you're using like the push or move tool, you'll squash the tube-like structure, you see. So it'll just look a little bit odd. Anyway, this is the external jugular, which runs superficial to the sternomastoid. And you can quite often see it in people's necks. The deep pulsation that you see in the neck, the jugular, jugular venous pressure, or the JVP, is actually the internal jugular vein. That's a much bigger vessel. It's in the anterior compartment, deep around the carotid artery, and it's very different structure altogether compared to this external jugular vein. The external will run across medial to lateral over the superficial surface of the sternomastoid, and will pass just lateral to the edge of the sternomastoid to enter into or join up with the subclavian vein, just as it disappears behind sternomastoid. So there we are. So we've got our subclavian vein, we've got our external jugular vein. So now we'll have another look at one of the paintings. So this one now shows the subclavian artery, which runs behind scalenus anterior, and we've also got a muscle running in a convoluted path, dividing the posterior triangle up into two spaces. This is the inferior belly of the omohyoid muscle. So we'll put these in. The omohyoid, which passes up, the anterior belly of that passes up to attach in the anterior compartment. But the posterior or the lateral or inferior belly of the omohyoid separates the posterior triangle space into a superior and an inferior triangle. The superior is the occipital triangle, and the inferior, which is very, very important area is the supraclavicular triangle or supraclavicular fossa. This is important because a lot of the lymphatics drain there, so you have several lymph nodes in the supraclavicular fossa around the subclavian vessels and the brachial plexus, where malignancies can metastasize. So in particular, on the right side, the right arm, the right breast, and the right side of the head and neck. On the left side, the left arm, the left breast, the left side of the head and neck, and the rest of the lower body. So you can get deposits in the lymph nodes from primaries in those areas. And we put our omohyoid in. It's a very, very small rudimentary muscle, but it's a very important landmark. And again, it's just made by replicating or duplicating one of the other muscles and then basically just narrowing it and squashing it and bending it so it curves a little bit. It actually is convex down as it traverses the posterior triangle. Now, I just copied the subclavian vein, or duplicated it, and pushed it further in, so it's deeper to scalenus anterior. And all you have to do is change the color of this, and then you've got the subclavian artery. So scalenus anterior separates the subclavian vein, which runs anteriorly, and the subclavian artery, which runs posteriorly to the scalenus anterior. And this is why you need that little space I was talking about earlier below the those four muscles that make up the floor of the posterior triangle, so that the subclavian artery can pass in there, and now we can put in the trunks of the brachial plexus. So these are the major nerves that produce multiple branches to supply the whole of the arm and around the shoulder. Again, we make the trunks of the brachial plexus from these tubes, but they need to be a little bit smaller. We'll do the brachial plexus in more detail in a future video because it's got quite a complicated structure, but it is very useful to know it, especially if you end up dealing with any kind of sort of injury or malignancy in that area, because potentially you could paralyze the arm. Now we'll just color these. Nerves are usually colored sort of yellow. So put that in and put them sort of displayed around the sort of subclavian artery area. I think my omohyoid is in the way, so we just kind of have to move it around a little bit and move the brachial plexus trunks as well a little bit. That's why this sort of practice is so useful, because it's giving you this spatial awareness that you just can't get from doing it any other way. And because it's not just a model that you've bought, you're playing around with, because you've made it, the understanding you get from it, I think, is much, much deeper and much more thorough. Particularly trying to fit things in is actually very interesting, because then you think, how does this fit in with that? I mean, and that's what I started to realize when I was first doing this 3D sculpting. So we've got our brachial plexus trunks there. And we'll just label all of those bits. And the subclavian artery, of course. Just do a bit more final tweaking, and then, so that's actually, we're progressing reasonably well. we'll have another look at one of the paintings, and we've got quite a few structures to add in now. So we've got the transverse cervical vessels, artery and vein, and we've also got the occipital artery running across the apex, and now we've got the spinal accessory nerve running downwards across Levator Scapulae from sternum to Trapezius, which it will supply. So let's put all these in. So just put in the two transverse cervical vessels first. So the transverse cervical vein drains directly into the external jugular, and the transverse cervical artery comes off the thyrocervical trunk, which is part of the carotid circulation in the anterior compartment, deep to sternum, and they run across the posterior triangle in this lateral direction. Okay, now that we've coloured those, we'll stretch them out a little bit. They're quite thin, but longish vessels. And of course, they run superficial to much of the contents of the posterior triangle, namely the Subclavian Artery, brachial plexus trunks, and so on. The other interesting thing is that they actually run anterior and posterior to the inferior belly of omohyoid. So the artery will actually pass behind the posterior belly, the lateral inferior belly of the omohyoid. We'll also put in the supraclavicular lymph nodes, which are obviously quite important in this area. I'm kind of experimenting with what sort of colours they should be. I mean, I've put this shiny green paint on them, but I don't think they look quite right. They look like peas rather than lymph nodes. So I might change the colour later. But you just need to have a few of them in that area just to demonstrate their presence. I normally put in 3 or 4. Yeah, 4 will be fine here, I think. So we just make those with a sphere, a primitive, and just shrunk it down and then just duplicated it. Yeah, so I'm having to fiddle around with the Levator Scapulae and the scalenus medius because in order to put the dorsal scapular nerve in, which will run out of the superficial surface of scalenus medius and under and into Levator Scapulae. So we just need to do a little bit of a fiddle there. This is one of the things that really takes a bit of time and practice for you to get used to just moving these things and getting the orientations and stuff right. There are actually a lot of really excellent tutorials on YouTube that I would recommend. That's how I learned most of how to use this app. There's a lot of functions in this app, I think, that I still don't know, and I'm still learning. So I would say to learn the ins and outs of the app, Nomad Sculpt, use some of these other, have a look at some of the tutorials on these other YouTube pages. One I would highly recommend is a Southern GFX. There's a guy, Glenn Southern, who's absolutely brilliant. Every video of his I watch, I learn some absolutely incredible things. And he always goes over all the sort of the new developments for the app, which is really, really useful because the developer of Nomad Sculpt is an extremely enthusiastic individual who is constantly updating the app. And so you'll find the app will change from week to week. Okay, so we've got our little dorsal scapular nerve put in now. And we've combined the lymph nodes. I've just simple merged them. Simple merge means that you can actually separate them again later if you need to, you know, in case you want to separate them up and do different things with them or whatever. So with our dorsal scapular nerve in the right place, we can go ahead and create our spinal accessory, which again, you know, we're just using a simple tube which you can manipulate and mold and pass that under the margin of sternomastoid and trapezius. And it sort of rests on Levator Scapulae, you know, in that oblique direction. It's obviously supplies sternomastoid and then passes to and supplies trapezius. Now here I'm demonstrating how once you've validated the tube, you then start using the move tool and you just wreck the shape, you know, which I've done here stupidly. So I'm now trying to smooth it out a little bit. But of course, you know, these things you learn as you go along, you know. And we'll just duplicate those lymph nodes and put those, another group around the spinal accessory. Now we've gone to our sort of post-render settings switched on, which is why the lighting changed dramatically. Things are a little bit darker, but you can tell the colors are much more sort of vibrant and the materials are a bit more reflective and so on. In fact, most of our structures are in now, really. We just need to just tweak a few things here and there. And that's already starting to come together quite well. Yeah, I think that green color for the nodes was not very good, so we'll try a yellow or something else. And here we've got the Occipital Artery, which actually runs deep to sternomastoid and deep to trapezius. So you only see a loop of it passing across the apex of the posterior triangle. The anterior and posterior parts will actually be buried under the respective muscles. So we'll push those bits back. So we're getting there now. Things are coming together quite well. You may find that you have to just change the depths a little bit, you know, move things up and down a little bit because there might be too much space or too little space for many of the structures. So we'll look at the final one of my paintings, which has got this sort of the last few structures in there. Namely, we've got the superficial cervical plexus, which are the four nerves that supply much of the skin, the side of the head and the neck, coming out from deep to sternomastoid and passing in 4 directions. So let's put these in, and that would be, that's more or less it, I think. So we'll just use the little tubes again to create these. So that's the lesser occipital running parallel to sternomastoid upwards and backwards. And because it's in 3D, you have to sometimes move them because they're actually pointing in the wrong direction. They're actually going in deep rather than superficial, which is the way they're supposed to be going. So yeah, that's better. So that's now the occipital going upwards towards the apex. Nice gold color, why not? So put in the great auricula. Now this is a very important nerve. The great auricula is quite a large cutaneous nerve, and it comes out from behind sternomastoid and runs upwards to supply the side of the ear and part of the head. It's very important because you normally expose it during a parotidectomy, and it's very important to preserve it because it's the easiest and most accessible cable graft you may need if you were to damage the facial nerve. Now, there's a couple of things about it though. The sternomastoid, as it runs upwards towards the mastoid tip, actually some of its fibers insert into the skin itself. So as you start dissecting the skin off sternomastoid more superiorly, you have to actually sharply dissect the muscle off the skin. And the great auricula is coming out there and is very easy to damage it. And certainly very easy to just cut it or injure it some way or other. But always try and preserve it if you can. Especially because, and it becomes a bit fiddly because when you're lifting the flaps, the great auricula seems to be sort of in the way. It's sort of like bridging the gap. So you just have to keep very gently dissecting it off either of the flaps, particularly the anterior base flap. Now then we've got the transverse cervical nerve, which is running medially and forwards. And then you've got the supraclavicular. There's usually about 3 or 4 of these branches, the supraclavicular nerves, that run downwards towards the supraclavicular fossa. And we need to have these going in a little bit deeper, yeah, that's right, so that they'll go around, or not around, but over the subclavian artery, the brachial plexus and all that. So it doesn't pass, they don't pass very close to it, but they will pass near it. And so sometimes have them branching quite early on, so we'll put a few of those branches in. So the supraclavicular nerves, and for these, it's better usually to just have all the nerves again simple merged, or I mean you can do a voxel merge if you like. I mean, I tend to use simple merge just in case you want to divide them again, and you want to break them up again and move them around or whatever. So that's easily done if they're if you do a simple merge. Just mark everything. Label everything. So you've got lesser occipital, great auricular, transverse cervical, and supraclavicular. And that's our superficial cervical plexus. Now all we're left with is just to tweak it a little bit, but basically most of our work is done. I'm just tidying up the positions of the vessels and things. And of course, as you can see, so a lot of them are just sticking out the back. So that we want to avoid that if we can. So we need to move the muscle layer back so that all our structures lie within the posterior triangle. So that's obviously quite important. The significance of the floor, these paraspinal muscles, is that you have a layer of fascia there, which is separating the compartments of the neck. So it's very important that these structures, these vessels and nerves, which are supposed to be in the posterior triangle, are moved forward to make sure they're within that fascial plane. Now, what I'm going to do here is just create a little, using a cone, which you can just flatten and enlarge. I'm going to create a sort of back wall for the entire specimen. And that way, we can fold it all round, and it'll stop light passing through. So that was kind of irritating me a bit, the fact that there's light coming through the gaps. So you can actually put a large sheet like this over the back and attach it to margins of the posterior triangle, namely Trapezius, Sternum, and the Clavicle, and seal those little spaces and give it a dark color, and it'll stop light coming through and making it look a little bit off. So this may be a bit of a fiddle, and it did take me quite a while to try and do this bit, but that's all right, don't worry. It's not a huge amount of time. Now here's an interesting a trick. So this is using the lasso with the masking tool. And so when you mask an area, it actually holds that area stiff. So any of the remainder of your object, using the gizmo, you can actually move and deform, but your masked area remains exactly where it was before. So that allows you to sort of create these sort of weird shapes. And this isn't the ideal sort of shape we want to make for this, but I'm just doing it as a bit of practice, really, but also it's just convenient, I guess. And then, of course, afterwards you can then demask that area, and then you can mold it or smooth it or whatever you need to. So that approximately gives us the shape of our structure. Now we've got, so that was just demasking it. And now we'll just do a bit of the smoothing. Now, you can use, with the smooth tool, dynamic topology. All right, that's in the topology menu. What that means is that it will actually actively repair your mesh. So the polygons, because every time we manipulate them, we damage part of the mesh. We damage some of the polygons. And what that means is that if you end up with too many damaged polygons, when you're trying to deform them or extrude them or move them or whatever, you can't do much with them because they just haven't got that capacity to make those changes. So what you have to do is try and repair that component so that when you then actively try and do things, the mesh will actually be responsive. Another way around of doing that is to subdivide. Subdivide basically means increasing the number of sort of components and polygons in the entire object. So you have a button for subdivision, again in the same menu. So that's actually a good way of increasing the topology, the complexity of a structure, if you want to do sort of more detailed sculpting or manipulation or whatever, modeling. And so if you've got, for instance, a cube with just 4,000 polygons, it's very unlikely to respond to any kind of delicate manipulation or anything. And if you even if you enlarge it significantly, you won't be able to do much with it. But if you then press the subdivide several times, so you get it up to, let's say, I don't know, 200,000, 300,000, you could then easily start manipulating it with much more sort of effect. Now here we just use the move tool to just push those sides back, against the edges of our posterior triangle, and then I'm just using the trim tool with the lasso just to trim the excess bits off. And then now we can just manipulate those bits and smooth them out, maybe even deposit a bit more of the clay, so they call it clay, deposit a bit more of that material just to, so that we can cover all the bits up and close up all the gaps. And then, so that will give you a much sort of more rounded, nicer sort of looking specimen. So here, what we're doing is just filling it up, using the inflate tool, which basically just makes the clay swell up a bit. And so you can use that to cover up all the bits that are sticking out. And you can use that with, I'm not using dynamic topology. You can see on the right, there would be 3 orange boxes if dynamic topology was on, but it isn't. And now we're using the smooth, but that is with the dynamic topology. So you can see that third box is now lit up, and then it's gone out again. So that just means that's basically, when you're using the smooth tool, it'll actually repair the mesh as we go along, you see. So it'll be much more sort of responsive to manipulation and things that we do. So we're kind of getting there now, and so we can now just use the gizmo to just shrink it a bit or enlarge it a bit, or do a few other bits here and there. And obviously, with 3D modeling, lighting is very important, and so quite often with these specimens, you'll have, with these models, you'll have lights on in several different directions, and so that's why it's very important to close up the little gaps, otherwise you'll get light leaks coming through, and it'll just look very strange. It won't look natural at all. So we're now, I think nearly there. So I think there's a few more gaps, I think, with the clavicle and the edge of this layer, but just give it a nice dark color, nice dark red color, and then I'm just doing the post-processing stuff to try and manipulate the lights and colors a little bit, make them a bit more vibrant and a bit more interesting, and then you can use the ambient occlusion, which is basically these sort of artificial shadows and things that the computer generates, which again increases the complexity of it a bit and gives it a bit more depth. The other thing, of course, you can use is the distance blur, so making subjects at a certain distance away from you a little bit more blurred than anything else, and that also gives a sort of feeling of depth and three-dimensionality to your model. And the reason for that is, of course, when we render an image of this, it is a 2D image. It's not a 3D image as such. You can't manipulate the model that way. So because it's a 2D image, you've got to try and use some other tricks to make your 3D model look much more kind of 3D, despite it being just a 2D image. The post-processing is very interesting because you can a variety of different things you can do to give very, very different looks. Depending on what kind of look you're looking for. Yeah. But there's some really, really interesting modes that you can use. So for instance, some of the lighting stuff you can use get some very, very interesting images out of it. The other thing is I tend to use the videos I make from this, I tend to then do post-processing as well as video editing on LumaFusion, which is probably the most advanced video editing app on the iPad. And you've got some incredible different looks, including sort of X-ray and that sort of thing. Those sort of images you can create with models like this in LumaFusion. So if you, I don't think LumaFusion is that expensive either. It's probably about $20 or $30. So if you're interested in video editing, I'd highly recommend it. I use it for almost everything because it's so easy to use, and you can put, you can put graphics on it. You can do voiceover, which is what I'm doing with it at the moment. Okay, so that's it. That's our model. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you enjoyed making this model. And the next video, we're going to start making some ossicles, the little bones in the middle ear. So if you like the video, please like it, and please share it, and please subscribe, and then I can make some more videos. All right, see you. Bye-bye.